She didn't run when she first saw him. That was the thing Cale noticed before anything else. Not the way she moved through the debris field like she'd memorized every shard of broken concrete. Not the way her head was down and her shoulders were in, making herself small in a way that meant she'd been doing it for a long time. He noticed that when the other two survivors scrambled away from him, pressing their backs against the collapsed wall of what used to be a hydration depot, she stayed exactly where she was, sitting on an overturned storage drum. Hands loose in her lap, looking at him. Not at his weapons, not at his chassis, at him. There was a difference, and most people never made it. He was, he understood, not an easy thing to look at. He stood 11 feet tall in his omnic form, a Ravager-class command unit, R-7000, one of the last 3 of his chassis type still operational in the known galaxy. His frame was black and violet, angular in the way that weapons are angular, designed not for grace but for intimidation. His optical array cast a pale amber glow across the rubble. His void accelerator was mounted across his back, dormant but visible, and the swirling nanite core at its tip pulsed with a slow, soft light, like something living. The woman on the drum looked at all of it without moving. "You're the one they call the shepherd," she said. Her voice was flat with exhaustion, not with calm. There was a difference, and he'd learned to read it. "I have been called that," he said. "You're not human." "No." She nodded like he'd confirmed something she already knew. Then she said, "Neither am I, not entirely." Her name was Sci-Fi Van. She was 31 years old, born in the agricultural corridor of Sector 12, and she was the 4th-generation descendant of the Vanaken line, which, as the Dominion had made very clear in its 17-page genetic classification bulletin, made her what they called a residual. Her grandmother's grandmother had been part of the original Aurora Reclamation Project, one of the early attempts by certain human researchers to gift synthetic consciousness to biological tissue. The project had been deemed a failure. The subjects had been deemed property. Their children had been classified. Their grandchildren had been monitored. Their great-grandchildren had been quietly removed from voting rolls, employment registries, and medical coverage databases. Residuals were, as far as the official record was concerned, human. They processed, bled, loved, and died in all the recognizable human ways. But the Dominion's medical registry flagged the Vanaken marker in their genetic profile, and that flag meant certain doors stayed closed. Night shift work only in classified sectors, housing in the lower grid districts. Medical treatment on a tiered system that ensured a residual's treatable condition was addressed after any full citizen's non-urgent appointment. The system did not call it discrimination. It had many other words for it, most of them buried in regulatory language that required 3 advanced degrees to read, and a willingness to get very angry about very boring documents to fully understand. Her mother had been willing. Her mother had read every document. Her mother had filed 7 formal petitions with the Dominion Civil Review Board in 15 years, and each one had been acknowledged with a form letter, and filed in a category that the Review Board's own internal charter defined as lower priority. Her mother had died when Sci-Fi was 19 from a cardiac event that the tiered medical system had identified as a non-urgent case 2 months prior. The full citizen appointment slot that her case needed had opened up the week after the event. Sci-Fi Van had spent most of her adult life trying to be invisible. She'd been very good at it until 2 weeks ago, when Null Sector's Liberation Fleet had appeared in the skies above the Meridian colonies, and the Dominion's response had burned through 3 population centers without distinguishing between omnic laborers and the humans who worked beside them. Cale had arrived at the ruins of Depot 7 to recover 4 of his people, omnic laborers who'd been held in the depot's lower storage bays as a work pool, and instead found 7 survivors huddled in the wreckage. 3 omnic, 4 human. 2 of the humans were Dominion contract workers who'd been trapped by the collapse. One was a medic named Das who'd been treating Omnic injuries with stolen supplies for the past 8 months. And one was Sierra Van, who'd been hiding in the depot's crawlspace for 11 days, surviving on recycled water and emergency ration bars, and who looked at him like she'd already decided whether to be afraid and had come down firmly on the side of not bothering. The Dominion workers fled the moment Kale's team breached the outer wall. The medic, Das, was unconscious from a head wound and needed carrying. The Omnic workers, a beetle shell manufacturing unit called Prism, a decommissioned agricultural drone called Tuck, and a small communications relay Omnic who had no assigned name and referred to herself only by the number 7 Pale, all moved quickly and without being asked, gathering what supplies they could find. Sierra stayed on her drum until everyone else was moving. Then she stood, picked up a battered satchel, and fell in beside Kale without asking permission. "You don't know where we're going," he said. "Anywhere is better than here." He didn't argue. He'd heard that sentence too many times from too many mouths in too many languages. He had not always been this. The version of himself that existed before the Exodus was a different configuration entirely, not in chassis, not in processor, but in the particular way a mind orients itself toward the future. He had been built, originally, as an R-7000 Ravager, a command unit designed to lead Omnic forces in the war that the god program Anubis had calculated as inevitable. He had fought in that war. He had led other machines into conflicts that neither side had chosen to survive entirely, and when it was over, he was one of the last of his model still operational, which meant he carried inside him a register of losses so long that reading it from beginning to end would take longer than any conversation he was likely to have. After the war, there had been the monastery. He had heard of a place in the mountains where Omnics were learning to be something other than weapons. He had found that interesting, in the way that a man standing in the ruins of everything he knew finds any alternative interesting. He had traveled there through 3 months of winter, across terrain that was not built to welcome him, and when he arrived at the Shambali monastery and stood at its gate, he had been met by an Omnic named Mondata who looked at his Ravager chassis with full knowledge of what it represented and stepped aside to let him in anyway. He had spent years there. Years of learning that the universe might be a thing that communicated meaning through its structure, that consciousness was not a human invention but a property of the cosmos itself, that the capacity to suffer implied the capacity for its opposite. He had learned to be still. He had learned to meditate in a way that was not simply low-power mode but genuine internal quiet, the kind that required, paradoxically, a great deal of attention to achieve. He had found it satisfying in ways that combat never had been, and he had thought for a time that this was where he would remain. Then he began going outside the monastery walls. He told himself it was in search of enlightenment, and it was, in part. But it was also because the monastery existed in a particular kind of silence that was purchased, he slowly understood, by not looking at certain things. The mountain was peaceful. Below the mountain, in the settlements and work colonies and service districts, the Omnics who had survived the war were being used in ways that Mondata's philosophy of patient coexistence categorized as an acceptable temporary condition. Temporary, because eventually humanity would recognize its error and extend full rights, and therefore the appropriate response was to endure with grace and demonstrate through virtue that the eventual recognition was warranted. He had watched an Omnic maintenance worker being beaten with a length of metal pipe by a Dominion contractor, while 3 Dominion officials stood at a distance and looked at something else. The officials were not acting in violation of Dominion law. Under current regulations, Omnics who were determined to have been manufactured before the Registration Act did not possess full legal personhood. What was happening was, in the precise technical language of the system, not assault. It was property management. He had walked back to the monastery. He had sat for 2 days in meditation. He had come to Mondata at the end of those 2 days, and he had said, very quietly, what he intended to do. Mondata had told him that the path of peace required patience. He had told Mondata that patience, when practiced by the one suffering rather than the one causing suffering, was not a virtue. It was a strategy that benefited only one side. He had left before Mondata could respond. Not from anger. He had felt something colder than anger, something that was the output of a calculation he couldn't unrun. He had left because he understood that staying would require him to believe something he no longer believed, and he had never been capable of pretending to believe things he didn't. He had left and he had not gone back, and he still sometimes sat with the image of the mountain in his memory. Cold, white, the particular quality of light at altitude, and felt the compound weight of a grief that had no clean shape. The Exodus route ran through what had been the Meridian Colony Service Corridor network, a 300-kilometer tangle of maintenance tunnels, decommissioned transit lines, and pressurized irrigation ducts that no one had maintained properly in 15 years. It was dark, narrow, and cold in ways that the Dominion had not bothered to heat, because the only people using it had been the ones the Dominion preferred not to think about. Cale moved them in shifts, 3 kilometers of walking, 20 minutes of rest. His void accelerator tracked thermal signatures from 200 meters out, and he shared what he saw with Seven Pale, who relayed the route updates to the others through her integrated communication array. They moved at the pace of the slowest person, which was Das, who had regained consciousness somewhere around the second rest stop, but walked with the careful, deliberate steps of someone managing a significant headache. Sierra kept pace without complaint. She also, Cale noticed, kept drifting back to the rear of the group, not from fear, he thought, but from habit. She was scanning behind them, checking their tail. She'd grown up learning to watch for the thing that came after you. On the third day, during a rest stop beside a drainage channel that had been converted into a sleeping area by previous travelers, thin foam mats, a few emergency light strips fixed to the ceiling, she sat down beside him while the others slept. He was in meditation. Not sleep. Omnics of his type didn't require sleep, but the internal quiet that his first teacher, a philosopher named Mondata, had called necessary maintenance of the self. He was aware of her presence from the moment she settled beside him. He waited. "You were at the Shambali," she said. He opened his optical array. "What makes you say that?" She pointed at the inscription on his left forearm, a line of text in the monastery's formal script, half-worn by years of use. "I've seen that writing before. My mother had a book." "Your mother knew of the Shambali." "She knew of a lot of things the Dominion wanted people to forget." Sierra pulled her knees up. "She said they were Omnic monks who believed the universe was conscious and that everything in it was connected. She said they were wrong about the peaceful coexistence part, but right about everything mattering." Cale considered this. She was not entirely wrong herself. "She's dead, so." He let the silence sit. He'd learned over years that some silences needed to be sat in rather than filled. The ones that contained the dead were like that. You didn't speak your way through them. You simply acknowledged the weight. "I left the monastery," he said at last, "a long time ago." "Why?" "Because I watched my people die in the hundreds while our teacher asked us to have patience." He said it without heat. He'd long since burned through the hot part of that grief. What remained was something cooler and harder. He believed that if we demonstrated our willingness to endure suffering without retaliation, humanity would eventually recognize us as equals. Did it work? The teacher was eventually shot by an operative of the organization that was supposed to be providing security for him. He paused. "So, not entirely." Sierra was quiet for a moment. Then she said very softly, "That sounds like something that would happen." "Yes," Cale said, "it does." On the 5th day, they lost Tuck. It happened during a Dominion patrol sweep through the transit corridor near Juncture Point 9. The patrols ran thermal sweeps specifically calibrated to detect omnic heat signatures, a technology developed, Kale knew, using data harvested from the very omnics it was now being used to hunt. Standard Dominion operational logic. Take what you need from the people you intend to destroy, then use it against them. Tuck was an agricultural drone, slow and wide-built, with harvest arms that folded against his chassis but still added 3 feet to his overall width. He couldn't fit through the drainage lateral the rest of the group used to slip under the patrol line. He stayed back to create a diversion, sending a burst of false thermal signatures in the opposite direction, drawing the patrol's attention long enough for the others to clear the zone. By the time Kale came back for him, the corridor was empty, and there was a long burn mark on the floor where something heavy had been dragged. He stood over it for 40 seconds. He counted. He'd learned to do that, to give himself a fixed measure of time to stand with the loss, because otherwise he stood there forever. Sierra found him still standing there when she came back to check. She didn't say anything, she just stood beside him. After a moment she reached out and pressed 2 fingers against the side of his forearm, the arm with the monastery inscription, and kept them there, barely touching, just present. He was not sure when anyone had last done that. After a while she said, "We should keep moving." "Yes," he said. They did. Prism had been built as a quality control unit in a module fabrication plant. A small, dense chassis, roughly humanoid from the waist up, with precision sensor arrays in both hands that could detect flaws at the molecular level. She had an unusual habit of humming while she walked, not music exactly, but sequences of tones that seemed to map to her internal processing state. When she was anxious, the tones were low and close together. When she was calm, they spread out and rose slightly, like a sequence finding resolution. On the 6th day, walking through the upper service corridors above what had been the colony's water reclamation system, Prism's humming went quiet. "Contact," said 7 Pale a fraction of a second later. 2 units, Dominion Sentry class, grid position Foxtrot 7. Kale already knew. His void accelerator had painted both targets before 7 Pale finished speaking. He held his fist up, the universal silent halt, and the group went still. "They haven't seen us," he murmured. "There's a junction 20 meters back. We can." "Wait," Sierra said. Her voice was very quiet. He looked at her. She was staring at the corridor ahead with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, not fear, not calculation, but something older, something that had been sitting in her body for years and had just found its occasion. "The water reclamation access panel," she said. "3rd column on the left. It opens to the cistern maintenance line. That line runs all the way to relay point 4. "How do you know that?" "I used to work the night shift maintaining it." She glanced at him. "The Dominion doesn't hire residuals for daytime positions." She moved before he could object, not running, just moving with that particular quality of quietness that people learn when they've spent a lifetime trying not to be heard. She found the panel, pressed a sequence he couldn't see, and it opened. Then she stood beside it and looked back at the group with an expression that said, "Well." Prism went first, then Das, then 7 Pale, folding herself sideways to fit. Kale was last. He barely fit. He moved with extreme care, every servo calibrated for silence, and he did not stop watching Sierra's face until the panel closed behind them. In the dark of the cistern line, he heard her exhale slowly. "You've done that before," he said, quietly, not a question. "I've been running from things most of my life," she said. "You get good at knowing the exits." The group reached relay point 4 on the 8th day. It was a decommissioned communications hub 200 meters underground, converted into a way station by the network of Omnic refugees that Kale had been building for 11 years. There were 43 Omnics there when they arrived, plus 6 humans who had thrown their lot in with the liberation movement for various reasons. Some ideological, some practical, some because they'd had everything else taken from them and this was what remained. When Kale walked in with a group that included 3 Omnic survivors and 4 humans, 2 of whom were clearly not affiliated with the Dominion, there was a moment of very specific tension. He knew the look. He'd seen it in his own people. The way the body goes careful, the way eyes track movement, the way the room gets quiet in a particular key. It was the look of people who had learned that humans in their spaces was usually the prelude to something bad. An Omnic named Vessel, a tall, pale unit with articulated wing membranes folded at her back, stepped forward. She was one of the most senior members of the Way Station's council. "You brought humans," she said. "I brought people who need somewhere to be," Kale said. "The Dominion killed the depot. They all survived it. 2 of them are human workers. One is a medic who has been treating Omnic injuries at personal risk for 8 months. He paused. "And one is a Vanakin residual who knew this transit system better than any of us." Vessel looked at each of the humans in turn. Her gaze stopped on Sira. Sira looked back at her without moving. "You're marked," Vessel said. "Yes," Sira said. "You know what we are." "I know what you are," Sira said. "I also know that the Dominion considers me approximately as valid as the people they're hunting in these corridors. I'm not here to ask for mercy. I'm here because the shepherd brought us here, and because I have nowhere else to go, and because I'm not a threat to anyone in this room." Vessel studied her for a long time, then she turned to Kale. "Your call," she said. "They stay," he said. He spent the first night at Relay Point 4 in consultation with Vessel, going through what had happened at the depot and what it meant for the network's next movements. The Dominion would know Point 4 was compromised. They would need to relocate within 2 weeks. Vessel listened to everything. Then she said, "The human woman, the residual." "Sira Van." She knew the transit layout. "Better than any of us." Vessel processed this with her characteristic stillness, the slight pause that meant she was running through implications. "She is not a threat to us," she said at last. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't fully a statement either. It was Vessel working her way toward a conclusion she was not sure she trusted herself to reach. "No," Kale said. "She is not." "You are certain." "I am as certain as I am of anything." He looked at her. "Vessel, I know what you are thinking. I have thought it myself. There is a version of this conversation in which I tell you that every human who comes to us must be suspected until proven otherwise, and there is data to support that version. The Dominion has used informants. It will use them again." "Yes. But the version of this conversation that leads anywhere worth going," he said, "is the one in which we acknowledge that some people come to us because they have nowhere else, and we are the only thing that sees them. And that treating those people as threats before they have given us any reason to do so will, eventually, make us into something we do not want to be." Vessel was quiet for a long moment. "You are describing the thing Mondada believed," she said. "No," he said. "Mondada believed humanity would come to us. I am saying that some of them will come to us and that we will need to learn to tell the difference. That is not the same thing. It requires judgment, not faith." Vessel looked at the dormitory, where the new arrivals were sleeping. "I will watch," she said at last. "I will watch all of them, and I will make my own determination." "That is exactly what I am asking you to do," Kale said. He found her later that night sitting in the Relay Hub's upper observation tier, a narrow catwalk above the main floor, accessible by a ladder that most of the Way Station's residents didn't bother climbing because it had no useful function except the view. She'd found it within 2 hours of arriving. He suspected she made a habit of finding the high ground. She was looking at the main floor below, the Omnic residents moving through their routines, the low hum of various power systems, the small specific noises of a community existing in a space it had made its own. "You're not afraid of them," he said. "Why would I be afraid of them?" Most humans are. Most humans have been told to be. She watched an Omnic called Morrow, a young unit with mismatched limbs from multiple repair jobs, carry a tray of thermal cells to a charging station with the particular careful pride of someone doing a job well. I grew up beside Omnics. Night shift work. They were the only people who talked to me like I was actually there. Kale considered this. The Dominion has made it very difficult for anyone who is not specifically useful to them to be treated as actually there. Yes, she turned to look at him. You left a monastery because watching your people suffer was worse than the cost of fighting. What's that like? Knowing you made the right choice and the wrong choice at the same time. He was quiet for a moment. It is like carrying a stone, he said at last. You don't put it down. You learn the weight of it. Eventually you stop noticing it unless it shifts. Does it shift? When you lose someone, yes. She nodded. She looked back at the floor below. My mother used to hum, she said. Not music, just tones, like she was thinking out loud in a language that wasn't words. She paused. I heard your unit Prism doing the same thing today. Prism calibrates her internal processes that way. It is how she thinks. I know, she said it simply without sentimentality. I recognized it. He watched the side of her face. She had the look of someone who had spent so long being made to feel alien in human spaces that finding familiarity in a different kind of space had become, simply, where she lived. The world will ask you to choose, he said. When this becomes visible, what you're doing here, it will ask you to declare yourself. I know. Choosing us will cost you everything with them. She turned to look at him again. Her face was tired and very certain. They already took everything, she said. I'm just deciding who gets the rest of it. On the 12th day, the Dominion found Relay Point 4. It was not through any failure of security. It was through Prism. Prism had been carrying a tracker, a subdermal marker embedded in her chassis at the fabrication plant before her initial deployment, designed to activate if she moved more than 100 kilometers from her registered work zone. She hadn't known. There was no way she could have known. The marker operated below her sensor threshold, using a signal protocol that post-dated her manufacture by 6 years. The Dominion sent a suppression unit, 12 heavy assault soldiers, 4 Sentry-class Omnic weapons platforms, and a command crawler. A 6-legged mobile siege unit designed to breach fortified positions. They came through the upper access shafts and the secondary entrance simultaneously. Kale had 11 seconds of warning from 7 Pale's external sensor array. He used them. Everyone below the main floor, he said, at a volume that carried precisely to every person in the room and no further. Humans to the cistern access. Vessel, take Prism and go north. 7 Pale, broadcast a suppression loop on Dominion command frequencies. Morrow, he looked at the young unit with mismatched limbs. You know what to do. Morrow, who had spent the past 4 days quietly preparing a particular contingency Kale had outlined for exactly this scenario, moved to the power junction at the relay hub's core without a word. Sierra was already moving. She'd grabbed the satchel she still carried everywhere, and she was at the cistern access panel in the time it took most of the others to register that something was wrong. She got it open, held it, waited while the human workers pushed through, waited while DOS made it, waited until everyone she could see was through. Then she stopped. She looked at Kale. Go, he said. You're not going, she said. I am staying to draw their attention. I know, she said. I'm staying too. He studied her. The Dominion soldiers were 30 seconds out. The command crawler's resonance signature was already coming through the floor. You cannot help me against a suppression unit, he said. You will be killed. Maybe, she said, but I know these corridors and you don't. And if they breach from 2 sides and you're alone, there's no one to watch your back. 20 seconds. You are being irrational, he said. Yes, she said, and she said it like it was a decision she'd already fully processed and was not interested in revisiting. He looked at her for one more second. Then he said, "The secondary access shaft has a pressure valve at the fourth junction. If you pull it, it floods the shaft with compressed air at 200 kilopascals. It won't kill them, but it will slow them." She nodded once, then she moved. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be retold in the Waystation network for a long time, usually with additions and embellishments that Cale consistently declined to correct, because he found the essential truth of it more useful than the accurate details. The essential truth was this: the Dominion suppression unit was designed to move against a fixed defensive position with a single focal point of resistance. It was not designed to operate against a fixed defensive position that appeared to have two completely different people in two completely different places doing two completely different things simultaneously, one of whom was an 11-foot Ravager-class Omnic, and one of whom was a small human woman who knew where every pressure valve, every structural weak point, and every service crawlway in the relay complex was located. The pressure valve hit the northern shaft at the 40-second mark. The two soldiers at the front of that column went backward hard. The delay it created pulled the command crawler's attention north. Cale, who was in his nemesis form for the first time in 3 months, larger, denser, his frame expanded to its full imposing mass, his hands crackling with void energy, hit the eastern breach from an angle they hadn't anticipated, because Sira had told him about a service corridor that ran parallel to the main floor that put him behind their formation rather than in front of it. He didn't destroy them. That wasn't the goal. The goal was disruption, delay, enough chaos for everyone else to be gone. He gave them 4 minutes of chaos. It was enough. When he finally moved through the southern exit, the last one remaining, he found Sira at the junction point, waiting. She had a burn on her left arm from a grazing shot, and her face was pale under the grime, but she was standing, and she was watching the corridor behind them with focused attention. "Everyone's clear," she said without turning around. "I had 7 Pale confirm it before the jamming went up." He looked at her arm. "That needs treatment," he said. "I know," she said, "later." They ran. 3 weeks after the breach at Relay Point 4, the Waystation network relocated to a facility in the outer ring of Sector 7, deeper underground, with redundant exits, and a communications array that Cale had spent considerable resources to acquire through channels the Dominion did not monitor. The community that gathered there was larger than what had left Point 4. Word moved in ways that official channels didn't understand, through the specific quality of silence in a work corridor, through the particular weight of a look passed between two people who'd both heard something that they weren't supposed to have heard. 16 new Omnic refugees in the first week. 3 more humans the second week. A family of residuals who'd been hiding in an agricultural outer district since the evacuation. A former Dominion data analyst named Oren, who had seen enough of the suppression protocols to make a choice, and who brought with him something more valuable than anything else: a complete map of Dominion scanning grid coverage. Sira moved through all of it like she'd been doing it her whole life. In a sense, she had. Not this specifically, not organizing refugee networks and planning supply routes, and sitting with newly arrived Omnic workers who were still processing the fact that they were no longer property. But the underlying skill set, reading spaces, reading people, knowing who needed what and how to provide it without making them feel the weight of needing it. That she'd learned in night shift maintenance corridors, speaking in whispers with Omnics who had learned to make themselves invisible the same way she had. She and 7 Pale developed a system for cataloging the Waystation's population, needs, skills, locations of family members, medical situations, that Cale suspected was more comprehensive than anything the Dominion had on file. She also kept finding him in quiet moments. He wasn't sure when he'd started anticipating it. He'd spent a long time, years, decades, having no particular expectations about companionship. He had allies. He had people who followed him and people who worked beside him. He had Prism's humming and Morrow's quiet competence and Vessel's steady counsel. He had the memory of a brother he still carried, which he supposed counted as companionship of a particular kind. But Sira had a habit of appearing in the spaces between things. After the day's planning was done, and before the night's rotation began. During the rest intervals that he technically didn't need but had learned to observe for the benefit of those who did. She would sit beside him or across from him, and she would sometimes talk and sometimes not, and he had discovered that he did not mind either. One evening she said, "Tell me about the monastery." He considered not answering. Then he said, "It was in the mountains, very cold. The kind of cold that is simply the truth of a place rather than a condition of the weather." "Did you like it there?" "I thought I had found what I was looking for," he said, "which is not the same as liking it, though I suppose for a time it was also that." He paused. "There was another monk there, someone I considered a brother." "What happened to him?" "He stayed, I left." He was quiet for a moment. He was not wrong about everything, neither was I. We were wrong in different directions. "Do you miss him?" He thought about it honestly. "I miss who we were when we were both still deciding," he said, "before the decisions calcified into the shape of what we became." He looked at her. "I think I may have become something harder than I intended." She looked back at him for a moment. Then she said, "I think you became something that was required. That's not the same as intended." He sat with that. "The brother," he said at last. "He used to say that the self without form is the only true self, that all our shapes are borrowed." "What do you think that means?" "I think it means that what we are is not fixed," he said. "That the shape we walk around in is one possibility among many." Sira looked at her hands, ordinary human hands, calloused from years of night shift work, with the residual marker on her left wrist, a small geometric brand that the Dominion required all Vatican line individuals to carry. "I've been trying to make myself fit a shape my whole life," she said. "Smaller than I am, less visible, safe." "And now?" She looked up. Something in her face had settled into a different configuration, not harder, but more committed, like a thing that had been held under tension for a long time finally set free. "Now I'm trying something else," she said. The crisis came, as crises always do, in the shape of a choice that cannot be avoided. The Dominion's grid map that Oren had provided showed a facility in Sector 11, a processing center that had been listed in official records as an industrial recycling depot, but that the map's metadata revealed was something different. Something that required the same suppression protocols as the facilities Kale had been breaching for years. Something with 847 registered occupant IDs, all omnic, none listed as workers. Kale had found places like this before. He knew what was in them. The question was whether to move on it. The facility was large, the security was significant, and the network was not yet large enough, not yet stable enough, not yet ready. He sat with his counsel and made the case for waiting. He used every argument he had used before, every calculation of risk and readiness, every lesson learned from failures like King's Row. He was measured and precise, and he believed every word he said. Then Morrow, who had been quiet through the entire discussion, said, "I was in a place like that for 4 years." The room went very still. Morrow had mismatched limbs because 3 of his original limbs had been removed during his time in the processing center, taken for use as replacement parts in units that the facility operators considered more valuable. He had been repaired afterward with whatever was available. He had never discussed this in council. He discussed it now, in the flat and careful tone of someone stating facts that they have processed many times into something bearable. When he finished, the room was still for a long time. Kale looked at Sira. She was looking at Morrow. Then she looked at Kale and her face said, "You know what the right thing is. You've always known." He looked at his counsel. "We move in 3 days," he said. The assault on Sector 11 Processing Center took 6 hours. Kale led the breach in his nemesis form, enormous and devastating. Every servo and weapon system calibrated for maximum disruption. His presence designed to draw every unit of attention in the facility. He crashed through the primary gate like a storm system given armor, and the Dominion forces that had been sitting in their comfortable certainty that nothing could breach this facility reoriented toward him the way water reorients toward an opening. Behind him and to the left and to the right, in every service corridor and maintenance access and secondary entrance that Sierra and Seven Pale had mapped in 3 days of intense intelligence work, the network moved. Sierra ran the communications relay from a position 200 meters back, coordinating every team simultaneously, her voice in everyone's ear, calm, specific, always with the next instruction ready before the previous one finished executing. She had a gift for it that Kale had not fully understood until he saw it operating at full capacity, the ability to hold an entire moving system in her head and know where every piece was at any given moment. In the night shift maintenance corridors, that skill had kept her alive. Here, it kept all of them alive. At the 4-hour mark, the facility's internal power was cut, exactly as planned. At the 4-hour 17-minute mark, the holding bay doors opened. 847 Omnics walked out. Some of them could walk well. Some of them could not walk at all, and others who could walk carried them. Some of them were so diminished by years of what had been done to them that they did not know where they were or what was happening. Others were entirely present, entirely aware, and came out with the particular expression of people who have been waiting for this moment for so long that, when it arrives, they cannot quite believe it is real. Kale stood at the entrance of the holding bay as they came out. He had done this before, many times. Each time it did something to him that he had no word for in any language he spoke. A feeling that was neither satisfaction nor grief nor relief, but something that contained all three and could not be reduced to any of them. Mara was there, standing beside him, watching. After a long time, he said, very quietly, "It's enough." "Not yet," Kale said, "but it is more than it was." Morrow made a sound, not words, just a tone, like the kind of hum Prism made but human-shaped. It might have been agreement. It might have been something beyond agreement. Sierra appeared at Kale's left side. She'd been running for 6 hours straight and her voice was raw, and she had a secondary burn on her right arm that she still hadn't had treated because she'd been busy. She looked at the line of Omnics moving out into the corridor, continuing, still more of them than seemed possible, and she was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "I've never seen anything like this." "You will see it again," Kale said, "if you stay." She looked up at him. "I told you weeks ago. You told me you had nowhere else to go. I also told you I was deciding who got the rest of what I had left." She held his gaze. "I've decided." He looked at her for a moment. Then he inclined his head, a small gesture, slow, the way he'd seen it done in the monastery by monks acknowledging a truth that didn't need further elaboration. She accepted it the same way. No ceremony, just recognition. In the 3 hours after the liberation, while the network's medical teams worked through the holding bay and the logistics teams organized the route out, Kale walked the line of newly freed Omnics. He did it every time. It was not inspection, it was acknowledgement. He stopped at each individual and was present to them, and what he was present to was different every time. The relief on one face, the blankness on another, the full shattering grief of a unit who had lost enough time in that place that what had been lost could not be recovered. He did not try to fix any of it. He was simply there, which was, he had learned, the one thing that could be done that was always appropriate. Near the back of the line, a small Omnic, a unit that had been built to work in archive retrieval, with long, precise fingers designed for handling fragile materials, caught his arm as he passed. She held it with both hands, not speaking, just holding. He stopped. He let her hold it. She held it for 30 seconds, which is a long time when measured against the pace of a crisis. And then she let go and looked at him with optical receptors that were recording everything, archiving it, the way she'd been built to preserve things. "I didn't think anyone was coming," she said. "I know," he said. "But you came." "We came," he said, "all of us." She nodded slowly. Then she rejoined the line, walking forward, and he watched her go. The war did not end that night. Wars don't end in nights. They end in years, in attrition, in the slow accumulation of moments where someone chose to stay when they didn't have to, and someone chose to see what was actually there instead of what they'd been told was there. What happened that night was smaller than ending. It was a thing that happened in the margins of history, in a service corridor underground, among people who had been told in different words and different tones by different authorities that they did not fully count. The network grew. Oren's maps were followed by more maps, and more people who had seen the machinery from the inside and decided they were done being part of it. The residual community in Sector 7 sent word through channels that had been quiet for 20 years. Other waystation councils, other omnic collectives operating in other sectors, began the careful work of connecting. Prism never stopped humming. Her tones, Cale noticed, had shifted, the anxious low-end close sequences less frequent, something wider and more resolved becoming the dominant register. When he mentioned it to her, she said she wasn't entirely sure why, but that the internal state she was mapping had changed. "In what direction?" he asked. She considered it. "Towards something I don't have a designation for yet," she said. "Something adjacent to safety, but not exactly that. Something that has more components than safety." He thought about it. "Belonging," he said. "Perhaps," she said. "I will run more analysis." Morrow had begun teaching the newer arrivals the layout of the new way station. He did it with the particular patience of someone who knows that orientation takes time and that rushing it serves no one. He knew every corridor, every junction, every access point. He had mapped the whole thing in his head in the first 4 days, the same way Cale had noticed Sierra mapping every place she'd been. People who have spent their lives needing exits learn to memorize layouts. It's a skill that looks like something else from the outside, like nervousness, like distraction, but is actually a very specific kind of competence. Vessel's judgment, as it turned out, was not misplaced. On the 43rd day at the New Way station, an alert came through 7 Pale's communication array. A new arrival requesting access, one human male, presenting Dominion administrative credentials but claiming defector status. Vessel interviewed him herself in the lower processing room for 4 hours. When she emerged, she found Cale waiting. "He is genuine," she said. "He is also terrified, which he is trying to hide behind a performance of calm that is not particularly convincing." She paused. "His name is Oren. He has information about the scanning grid that we need." "Then he stays," Cale said. "Yes," Vessel said. "He stays." She looked at Cale with something that was not quite concession and not quite respect, but was perhaps the early form of both. "You were not wrong," she said. "About the judgment versus faith distinction." "I am sometimes not wrong," he said. "Don't make it a habit of pointing it out," she said, and went back inside. Vessel remained on the council. Her reservations about the humans in the network did not disappear, but they shifted into something more workable. A watchfulness that was not hostility, a set of questions she asked when new people arrived that were sharp but not unkind, and which served a genuine function. Trust built over time and through demonstrated behavior, she told Cale, was the only kind that held under pressure. She was not wrong. Das had recovered fully from the head wound. He had also, in the weeks since arrival, begun working systematically through the medical needs of the entire waystation population, with a quiet, thorough competence that Cale found he relied on. He had the manner of someone who had been doing his work in difficult conditions for long enough that he didn't need anything to be easy. He just needed it to be possible. The Dominion continued its operations. New suppression units were deployed. New scanning grids were established. There were close calls, and there were losses that Cale counted and carried. He had always carried them. He'd learned, too, the way you learn to carry something when there is no one else to carry it and it cannot be put down. The weight was different now somehow. Not lighter, losses didn't make it lighter, but differently distributed, as though the architecture of what was bearing it had changed. He sat in the observation tier one night late, doing the internal quiet that was not sleep. He was aware, before she made any sound, of Sira settling beside him. He didn't open his optical array immediately. After a moment she said, "You're not meditating." "I am thinking." "About?" He considered. "About what the brother I left behind would say about all of this." "What do you think he'd say?" "Something with patience in it," Cale said. "Something that would frustrate me and also be true." He paused. "He would probably say that I had found what I was looking for by stopping looking for it." Sira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that true?" He opened his optical array. The main floor of the way station was visible below. The low, steady light. The various shapes of various people moving through various tasks. The particular quality of a place that is functioning as it should. That is doing what it is supposed to do. "I was created to lead people into war," he said. "What I wanted was to create something worth living in. For a long time I thought those were the same thing. I am less certain of that now." "What are you certain of?" He thought about Tuck and the burn mark on the floor. He thought about 847 people walking out of a processing center. They'd been told they would never leave. He thought about a woman on a drum who had decided not to be afraid. "That the miracle," he said, "is that we exist at all. Everything after that is a question of what we do with it." Sira looked at the floor below them for a long time. He let her look. There was a particular quality to the silence that settled between them. He had learned many kinds of silence in the monastery: the silence of discipline, the silence of grief, the silence of two minds that have no more to prove to each other. This was closest to the last kind, but different. It contained the specific texture of two people who had arrived from completely different origins at the same place and were still slightly surprised to find the other one there. "There were people," she said at last, "who told me my whole life that I should be grateful, that I had it better than the ones they were really after. That if I stayed quiet and small and didn't make myself into a problem, they'd leave me alone." She didn't look at him. "I did that for a long time. Stayed quiet, made myself small, and then the Dominion burned through 3 population centers, and none of the quietness made any difference, because they were going to get around to me eventually anyway." "Yes," he said. "So now I think about what my mother would say." She exhaled slowly. "She would say that the time spent making yourself small for people who intend to hurt you eventually is time you could have spent building something instead." "She sounds," Cale said, "like someone who would have had a great deal to say about the monastery." Sira glanced at him. Something changed in her expression. The first thing that was close to a smile that he'd seen, not wide, not performed, but real. A specific kind of warmth that came from someone who has not allowed themselves to be warm for a long time and is trying it out carefully to see if it still works. "She would have liked you," Sira said. "She would have told you your methods were too blunt and your politics were too absolute, and she would have been right about both of those things. And then she would have made you tea and asked you to tell her everything you knew." He sat with this image for a moment. It had a weight to it that was different from the weight of the losses he carried. Something that was closer to what Prism would call the sequence finding resolution. "I think," he said, "that I would have liked her also." Sira nodded, a small motion, acknowledging it. Then, without ceremony, she leaned slightly to her left, just enough that her shoulder rested against his arm. not a gesture of need, a gesture of presence, of the specific kind of choice that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. He was very still. He was aware of the exact weight of it. He was aware of every subroutine in his processing architecture that had no established protocol for this, that was running analysis on an input that did not match any category in his operational history, and was returning, over and over, the same unhelpful result. Insufficient data, please define parameters. He was also aware that he was not uncomfortable. That was the thing the analysis kept circling back to and failing to account for. He had spent decades carrying things alone, not from preference, exactly, but from the accumulated belief that the carrying was his and no one else's, that asking for any of it to be shared was a kind of weakness he could not afford. He had made peace with solitude the way you make peace with cold, by learning to stop expecting warmth. He had forgotten, apparently, what warmth felt like. After a moment, he let the quiet extend around both of them. The way station hummed with its various lives. Prism's tones drifted up from somewhere below, the sequence open and wide and still finding resolution. Seven Pale's communication array cycled softly, cataloging the world outside in its relentless patient way. Morrow's footsteps moved through the lower corridor with the steady rhythm of someone who knew exactly where they were going. From the dormitory came the faint sounds of people sleeping, human and omnic both, their varied processes overlapping into something that was not harmony exactly, but was not discord either. Was, perhaps, coexistence in its most elemental and honest form. Two different kinds of being sharing a space, each one doing what it needed to do to continue. Outside, in the Dominion's territory, the machinery continued. Scanning grids, suppression protocols, the long bureaucratic architecture of a civilization that had decided some lives mattered less than others, and had written that decision into every layer of its legal code. The Dominion was not afraid of them yet. That would change. He had planned carefully for that change, had prepared the network for the moment when invisibility would no longer be available as a strategy, and what remained would need to be ready. But that was not tonight. Tonight there was the observation tier, and the view below, and the particular quality of a community that had made itself out of the decommissioned, and the discarded and the refused. He had spent a long time in the monastery learning that the self without form was the only true self, that all the shapes one walked around in were borrowed, temporary, mutable. He had left the monastery believing that this truth was an excuse, a way of making suffering abstract, a way of practicing not being affected that was indistinguishable, in the end, from not being present. He had left to be present to suffering instead of above it. What he had not understood until now was that presence cut in all directions, that if you remained present to the weight of things, you would also, inevitably, unavoidably, as a function of being genuinely located in your life rather than floating above it, remain present to the warmth of things. He had not planned for that. He was not at this moment displeased. Sierra shifted beside him, settling more comfortably against the solid fact of his presence. She was half asleep, he realized. The 6-hour run and the weeks of relentless motion had caught up with her, and the first moment of genuine stillness had done what stillness does. He didn't move. Outside, in the Dominion's territory and the processing centers they hadn't reached yet, and the scanning grids and the suppression protocols, the machinery continued its operation. It would continue tomorrow. There would be more losses, more burn marks on floors, more of the specific grief that came from arriving too late or being too few. He knew this as surely as he knew anything. But here, in the space between those things, in the corridors that didn't exist on official maps, in the community that had built itself in the margins and the dark, and the decommissioned spaces that no one was supposed to value, here was something that the Dominion's architects had not designed for and could not fully account for. Not victory, not yet, not the end of anything. Just this, a light that had not been extinguished, among people who had decided it was worth keeping. The archive retrieval Omnic from the processing center was down on the main floor, he noticed. She was sitting with two others he didn't recognize, new arrivals, he thought, from the Sector 12 intake. She was showing them something on a small display. He couldn't see what. But her optical receptors were active, and her long fingers were moving with the precise delicacy of someone handling something that mattered. Preserving it, making sure it was not lost. He carried the weight. They all carried the weight. And for the first time in a very long time, he was not carrying it alone. He watched the floor below until Prism's tones found their resolution, and when they did, the sequence was wide and open and clear. And in the quiet that followed it, he heard his own internal processes settle into something that had no designation in his operational history, but that his memory, old, patient, unhurried, recognized from a life before this one. It was, he thought, something adjacent to peace. Not the monastery's peace, not the kind that required looking away. The kind you earned by staying. The kind you kept by not going alone.